White's most popular way to open the game is by directly occupying the center with either e4 or d4 on the first move. If White wants to explore other options, the English is one of the most trusted, solid alternatives. We reach the strategically complex opening by starting the game with c4. Turning the game into the English opening, White controls the d5 square and typically prepares a light-squared strategy with knight c3, g3, and bishop g2, increasing control over the central d5 and e4 squares. The English should not be viewed as a simple sideline. It's a rich opening with a wealth of strategic as well as dynamic ideas to explore. Let's take a look at some of the basic ideas, starting with Black's most principled response, e5. Occupying the center, creating a mirror image of the razor-sharp Sicilian defense if White opens the game with e4 and Black replies with c5. In this way, White can be said to be playing a Sicilian defense up a tempo. Although this may suggest the play will become quite sharp, which is possible, White can also use this extra tempo to steer the game toward more positional waters typical of the English opening. Increasing control over the central light squares with knight c3 is a popular option, and White may also prepare to develop the light-squared bishop with g3, preparing to meet the natural knight f6 with bishop g2. White's light-squared bishop is an important piece in the English, supporting both the center as well as adding pressure against Black's queenside. We reach a critical moment in the English. Black must decide how to handle the central struggle based upon the d-pawn. Striking in the center with d5 creates a reversed open Sicilian type of position, which we'll later examine. The d-pawn may also be used to support the center by playing a future d6. One typical plan is to develop the other knight with knight c6. White's strategy to control the central light squares continues with knight c3, joining the c4 pawn and light-squared bishop and adding a third defender of the d5 square. Black's dark-squared bishop has two important squares to consider. Bishop b4 adds pressure against White's knight on c3, when White has to decide whether to allow bishop takes c3, gaining the bishop pair, but accepting a slightly compromised pawn structure in the process. In this case, White may continue with knight f3, simply continuing to develop while fighting for central control. On the other hand, the knight may leap into the center with knight d5, confronting Black's dark-squared bishop. In this case, Black may respond with bishop c5, increasing pressure against White's kingside, leading to a complex positional struggle. Bishop b4 is a popular choice to examine, and Black may also consider the straightforward bishop c5, adding pressure against White's kingside while preparing kingside castling. White's knight on g1 has two important paths to consider in order to enter the game. Playing e3, followed by knight g to e2 is an interesting idea we'll later examine, preparing to strike in the center with d4. The most direct path is to play knight f3, adding pressure against the e5 pawn while preparing to castle. Black should not be too eager to lunge the pawn forward with e4, as this is well met by knight g5, attacking the e4 pawn and revealing the light-squared bishop as a third attacker against this overly zealous pawn. Black is unable to maintain this premature claim of central space. Instead of advancing the e-pawn, Black can build a solid pawn chain with d6, supporting the e5 pawn while liberating the light-squared bishop. A common continuation is for both sides to castle. When White defines the typical pawn structure with d3, the pawn chains serve as a compass to help orient the direction of play. White's pawn chain from e2 to c4 points toward the queenside. Coupled with White's light-squared bishop pointing in that direction, White will typically plan to expand on that side of the board with a3 and b4. Black's pawn chain from c7 to e5 points toward the kingside, so coupled with Black's bishops pointing in that direction, this may prove to be a desirable area of the board to play. Of course, this is only a useful guideline and should not serve as an absolute direction of play. Grandmaster Michael Adams played the typical a6, supporting the b5 square while extending the dark square diagonal for Black's bishop, creating an important escape square on a7 if necessary. His opponent, Grandmaster Magnus Carlsen, continued with the typical English strategy of queenside expansion with a3. Anticipating b4, Black decided to tuck his bishop away on a7. It's important for White not to forget that this bishop still exerts important influence against the kingside. White expanded on the queenside with b4, when Black centralized his bishop with bishop e6. Contemplating the d5 pawn break would prove unwise if White is able to respond with knight g5, attacking the bishop while revealing the light-squared bishop's pressure against the d5 pawn. On the other hand, black may have no immediate intention of playing d5 and may be prepared to play queen d7, centralizing the queen, also creating a queen-bishop battery pointing toward white's kingside. Bishop b2 is one sensible choice, and Grandmaster Carlsen decided to play knight d2, revealing the light-squared bishop's pressure down the long diagonal. Now that white's knight is no longer able to meet d5 with knight g5, d5 is an interesting pawn break to explore. White was not afraid of this option, as c takes d5 opens up the c-file, which may later be utilized by a rook. And it also prepares the possible option of knight c4, adding pressure against black's central e5 pawn. It's also possible to prepare the d5 pawn break with knight e7, with c6 and d5 to follow. Playing knight e7 immediately would hang the b7 pawn, so Grandmaster Adams supported it with rook b8. The rook is pleased to vacate the long diagonal, avoiding the dangerous glare of the light-squared bishop. The game continued with rook b1, supporting a possible b5 pawn break, when black continued with knight e7. Now that the knight is no longer under attack by white's light-squared bishop, preventing white from comfortably advancing on the queen side with b5 is suddenly in the air. So white prevented this while grabbing more space on the queen side with a4. c6 is one reasonable choice, when white will likely increase the queenside tension with b5. Grandmaster Adams decided to focus on development with queen d7. We reach a critical moment in the game. Many English players understandably prefer to keep their strong light-squared bishop on the board, exerting important pressure down the long diagonal. That being said, it's important to not become overly attached to this piece, because if white plays rook e1, preparing to meet bishop h3, attempting to trade bishops with bishop h1, white can actually land into trouble quickly after knight g4. White is suddenly reminded that black's dark-squared bishop is alive and well on a7, threatening the f2 pawn. If white tries to block this diagonal with e3, then black's kingside initiative comes to life after f5, threatening to blast open the f-file with f4 when white is under serious pressure. In this case, preserving the light-squared bishop is definitely not worth the problems on the kingside. Grandmaster Carlsen was not afraid to allow black to spend time in order to exchange light-squared bishops, so he continued with b5, invading black's territory while also clearing the path for white's dark-squared bishop to enter the game. We see these ideas in action after bishop h3 and bishop a3. White enjoys a space advantage on the queen side, although black's idea to exchange light-squared bishops takes some of the sting out of this pressure. Black's position is quite solid, as the central stronghold on e5 remains secure. Knight f3 is a popular, straightforward way for the kingside knight to enter the game. A more subtle approach is to first play a3, which certainly seems like a strange way to help develop the knight on g1. The idea is to play e3, followed by knight g to e2. In order to better understand why a3 is an interesting option to explore, let's first take a look at the more direct approach e3. This is a nearly universal setup white can employ in most variations of the English, preparing knight g to e2, and in many circumstances d4. Playing e3 does weaken the d3 square, allowing the tactical shot d5. This appears to simply blunder a pawn, but the point is that c takes d5 is well met by knight b4, threatening knight d3 check. One reasonable response for white is to play d3, preventing the unpleasant check on d3, but it does allow knight b takes d5 with a roughly level game. White may also try to complicate matters by playing d4, provoking the central exchange e takes d4, e takes d4. It's important that black does not play bishop takes d4, hoping that white will capture the bishop, allowing the deadly fork knight c2 check, winning the queen. Bishop takes d4 may set up a trap, but it's actually black who falls into the trap after queen a4 check, attacking the king and unprotected knight, winning a piece. A stronger response is to play bishop e7. White should not be overly focused on trying to protect the extra d5 pawn, as moves like bishop f5 are in the air, preparing unpleasant threats such as knight c2 and knight d3 check. White may continue with knight g to e2, allowing black to regain the pawn. This is a perfectly playable option as long as white is comfortable playing with an isolated queen's pawn. There is plenty of play in the position, but some players prefer to avoid opening the game and clarifying the structure so quickly. Playing the immediate e3 is certainly worth exploring, although black appears to gain a good game after d5. An interesting way to prepare this move is by first playing a3. This helps prepare e3, as black cannot rely upon d5, followed by knight b4. a3 is also a useful move to prepare queenside expansion with b4. It's possible to discourage this plan with a5, but this does weaken the b5 square, and white may still be able to achieve an eventual b4 with proper preparation. A more flexible choice is to play in the style of Grandmaster Michael Adams with a6, creating the familiar escape square on a7 if necessary. His opponent, Grandmaster Viktor Lasniczka, continued with e3. When after black castled, we see the kingside knight enter the action from the e2 square. The knight is a bit less active than it was on f3, but in this case the light-squared bishop enjoys greater freedom on the long diagonal. Grandmaster Adams continued with the typical d6, supporting the center while liberating the light-squared bishop. White has a variety of options to explore, including b4 and castling kingside, but white decided to play the prophylactic h3, discouraging bishop g4 as white prepares the central pawn break d4. In some cases, white may even consider g4 and knight g3, eyeing the enemy f5 and h5 squares, but continuing to weaken the king side is not a decision to take lightly. Grandmaster Adams continued with bishop a7, but let's first understand why black wouldn't activate the light-squared bishop with bishop e6. This appears to be a strong move, activating the bishop while attacking the c4 pawn. But now the light-squared bishop and knight on c6 are suddenly in forking distance of a pawn. Instead of defending c4 directly, white has the strong tactical shot, d4, attacking the dark-squared bishop, so after e takes d4, the dark-squared bishop cannot both retreat to safety as well as prevent the deadly fork d5. So after bishop a7, white simply wins a piece with d5, forking the bishop and knight, an instructive tactical resource to keep in mind. The dark-squared bishop is vulnerable to both d4 and b4, so black spends a tempo to secure this piece with bishop a7. White is preparing to strike in the center with d4, possibly opening the center, so this is a good signal for white to castle. Now that the bishop is on a7, no longer vulnerable to a d4 shot, attacking the c4 pawn with bishop e6 is possible, when white may respond with b3 or knight d5, interesting options worth considering. In the game, Grandmaster Adams decided to centralize his rook with rook e8, when white completed his plan of central expansion with d4. In the game, black decided to play h6 before playing e takes d4. It was also possible to play e takes d4 immediately, when after e takes d4, opening up a path for the dark-squared bishop, black can secure the g5 square with h6, eliminating any possible bishop g5 ideas, while also creating a potential escape square for the light-squared bishop after bishop f5, opening up the h7 square if necessary. White is in no rush to play d5, gaining a tempo against the knight but also revealing the dark-squared bishop's pressure down the diagonal. This also opens up the e5 square for black's knight, attacking the c4 pawn. In these sorts of positions, it's often a good idea to play king h2, helping secure the h3 pawn, as well as avoiding the unpleasant alignment with black's dark-squared bishop, which can be a source of tactical oversights later in the game. White is prepared to expand on the queen side with b4 and decide whether the bishop is best placed on b2, e3, or f4. Black may consider knight e7, clearing the path for c6, and if allowed, d5, fighting for central space. The position remains roughly balanced, but this is a typical English position in which all of the pieces remain on the board, with only a single pawn exchange so far, leading to a rich middle game struggle. So far, we've examined black's solid approach of reinforcing the center with an eventual d6, typically after the dark-squared bishop has entered the action so as not to interfere with its scope. A more ambitious approach is to use this pawn to strike in the center with d5. This can be prepared by first playing c6, when white can play the provocative knight f3, attacking black's center and trying to lure the center pawn forward, leading to double-edged play. Or white may decide to strike in the center immediately with d4, another important variation worth examining. A more direct as well as popular way to provoke a central crisis is to strike in the center immediately with d5. turning the game into the reversed open Sicilian, an e4 opening with colors reversed, mimicking how white handles the Sicilian, except being down a tempo. White should put an immediate end to black's central pawn duo with c takes d5, knight takes d5. In exchange for opening the d-file for black, white enjoys a semi-open c-file. Black enjoys more space in the center, and behind it the potential for more active piece play. But white will try to prove the time advantage, as well as piece pressure will have its say after bishop g2, threatening the knight on d5. Retreating the knight to b6 is black's most common choice, but in order to better understand why this is the case, let's take a look at the natural response bishop e6. Developing a piece while supporting the knight, white continues with knight f3, attacking the e5 pawn, so black defends the center with knight c6. After white castles, white is ready to strike in the center with a thematic pawn break d4, so any normal move such as bishop e7 is well met by d4, striking in the center and preparing to meet e takes d4 with knight takes d4. White's centralized knight attacks the knight on c6 as well as light-squared bishop on e6. This move also clears a path for the light-squared bishop, exerting serious pressure on the long diagonal. Black's position is already uncomfortable, so this is a position black should avoid. Since d4 is a positional threat, what happens if black tries to discourage this pawn break with bishop c5? This actually fails to prevent white from striking in the center thanks to the center knight fork trick, knight takes e5, destroying black's pawn center, activating the light-squared bishop, and luring the enemy knight into the center with knight takes e5. When white is once again able to strike in the center with d4, forking the bishop and knight with an excellent game for white. The natural bishop e6 allows white to prepare a well-timed pawn break with d4, leading to a comfortable game for white. Now we can better understand why black's main response is knight b6, moving the threatened knight to safety while revealing the queen's protection of the d4 square. A popular continuation is knight f3, threatening black's center while also preparing a possible central pawn break with d4. So black decides to respond to both of these ideas with knight c6. White typically remains flexible with the central pawns by castling. Let's follow a top-level game to get a sense of the typical ideas for both sides. Grandmaster Veselin Topalov activated his dark-squared bishop with bishop e7, preparing to castle kingside. His opponent, world champion Magnus Carlsen, demonstrated a typical idea for white in the English, building a flank attack on the queenside, starting with a3, preparing to grab more space with b4 on the next move. It's possible to prevent white's idea with a5, weakening the b5 square as well as removing a defender of the knight on b6. In this case, white typically continues with d3, bishop e3, and rook c1, building pressure on the queenside. Black will likely castle, followed by centralizing the light-squared bishop with bishop e6, leading to complex play. Instead of spending a tempo on discouraging b4, Grandmaster Topalov decided to castle. When after b4, it looks like b5 is a serious threat, removing the guard of the e5 pawn. But Grandmaster Topalov continued with the main response, bishop e6. This is a clever move, trying to lure white into playing b5, when black is prepared to centralize the knight with knight d4. White is still doing fine and may consider playing a move such as rook b1, but if white tries to grab a pawn with knight takes e5, this is punished by bishop b3. Suddenly white's queen is short of squares, and unlike with the rook on b1, when white can respond with rook takes b3, white's queen is forced to the e1 square, allowing black to play the powerful knight c2, forking the queen and rook with a completely crushing position. Instead of playing b5 immediately, Grandmaster Carlsen calmly played rook b1, supporting the b4 pawn while eliminating any knight d4 tricks as the rook protects the b3 square. This means that white is actually threatening b5, preparing to win the e5 pawn on the next move. With this in mind, black reinforces the center with f6, securing the e5 square, preparing to meet b5, by once again centralizing the knight with knight d4. Trading knights allows black to control more space with e takes d4, gaining a tempo against the knight on c3. Once the knight moves, black will continue with bishop d5, centralizing the bishop while trying to neutralize white's light-squared bishop. We once again see the value of the rook on b1, preventing any bishop b3 tricks, so white evicts the invading knight with e3. Initiating the exchange, knight takes f3 check. Bishop takes f3. The light-squared bishop makes its presence known, attacking the sensitive b7 pawn. One interesting option to explore is queen c8, defending the pawn on b7, creating a queen-bishop battery pointing toward white's kingside, and this also clears the d8 square for black's rook, aligning with the enemy queen. In the game, Grandmaster Topalov decided to defend the pawn with rook b8, when Magnus advanced in the center with d4. Not minding an exchange of pawns with e takes d4, e takes d4, accepting an isolated queen's pawn, but opening up a path for the dark-squared bishop, as well as opening up the e-file for white's rook. White is prepared to grab more space on the queen side with a4, and possibly gain a tempo against the knight with a5. In the game, black decided to support the e5 pawn with bishop d6, and another interesting idea is to play queen d7, connecting the rooks on the back rank while activating the queen. White's position may be slightly more comfortable to play, but black is certainly not without resources as well. e5 is black's most critical response to the English, directly occupying the center, challenging white's overall strategy to control the center from a distance. It's worth noting that if black is willing to face the queen's gambit, then we may see e6, crossing white's plan to dominate the central light squares, preparing to meet knight c3, with d5. Striking in the center, when white will likely transpose into the queen's gambit declined after d4, transposing into one of the more solid openings after white opens the game with d4 on the first move. Another interesting way to fight for control over the central light squares is with c6, limiting the scope of white's light-squared bishop if white continues with g3 and bishop g2. White may decide to respond with e4, transposing into the Caro-Kann after d5, one of the more solid defenses against e4 on the first move. Just like playing against e6 on the first move, white may decide to play the flexible knight f3. When after d5, white has several interesting choices. d4 transposes into a Slav or semi-Slav defense. g3 or b3 turns the game into the ready opening, a close relative to the English, which is a subject of another video. The main point to keep in mind is that the English isn't fully an independent opening system, so a willingness to learn the ready or Queen's Gambit positions will strengthen your understanding, as well as overall ability to play the English as white. We conclude our initial journey in the English opening with black's symmetrical response c5. Instead of trying to immediately imbalance the game like e5 on the first move, this symmetrical approach is a solid alternative, allowing white to provide more information before committing to a particular setup. Just like the e5 lines, we are merely scratching the surface of this fascinating variation, as there are so many different approaches to consider. White can explore knight f3, preparing a quick central strike with d4, with or without the inclusion of e3. Let's see what happens when both sides continue to play in a symmetrical manner with knight c3, knight c6, g3, and g6. The kingside bishops exert their influence over the long diagonals with bishop g2 and bishop g7. We maintain a symmetrical position, but this does not mean that both sides are content with a lifeless draw. It is true that both sides may continue to play in a symmetrical fashion when the positions may become a bit dry. For example, e3 may be met by e6, but black may decide to break the symmetry with e5. Another example of breaking the symmetry can be found after a3. This can be a tricky move if black isn't careful. White is preparing queenside expansion with the well-timed b4. The symmetrical approach with a6 is certainly possible, but just one of several interesting ways to imbalance the game is by playing e6, preparing the straightforward plan of knight g to e7, castle kingside, and likely strike in the center with d5. White may prepare b4 by playing rook b1, but a tricky option to explore is playing b4 immediately. White is willing to sacrifice a pawn after c takes b4, a takes b4, and knight takes b4. This is not a pawn sacrifice black should want to accept. Not only does white's rook enjoy great activity on the a file, the move e6 weakened the a3 to f8 diagonal, so white can exploit this weakness with bishop a3. You know it's a bad sign if one of black's best moves is bishop f8, trying to protect the knight. a5 simply doesn't work after white captures the knight, revealing the rook's pin against the a5 pawn. And after the natural knight c6, white has the powerful shot knight b5, threatening knight d6 check when black's position is in serious trouble. Bishop f8 is well met by bishop d6, threatening knight c7 check. And even bishop b2 is a reasonable reply, taking advantage of the weak and long dark squared diagonal. If black tries to grab the rook with bishop takes a1, white's dark square dominance decides the game with knight d6 check. When after king f8, instead of knight takes c8, discovering the bishop's check against the enemy king, certainly a strong move, white can also play the patient queen takes a1, capturing the bishop while threatening the rook in the corner. In addition to the hanging rook on h8, knight takes c8 check is still a deadly resource, so black's position is simply falling apart. Accepting the pawn sacrifice with c takes b4 is not a wise decision, but since white decided to play this aggressive flank attack with the rook still on a1, black has the strong resource knight takes b4. Preparing to meet a takes b4, with c takes b4, taking advantage of the pinned c3 knight. One grandmaster game continued with d4, occupying the center while restricting black's active dark squared bishop. White is prepared to meet b takes c3, with e3, preparing to collect the pawn with knight e2 and knight takes c3. Grandmaster Vladimir Tukhmakov continued with knight e7, when his opponent, Grandmaster Alexander Delchev, continued with knight e2. White is prepared to play knight takes c3, so Grandmaster Tukhmakov played the well-timed central strike, d5, attacking the unprotected pawn on c4. Knight takes c3 is a reasonable choice, preparing to meet d takes c4 with queen a4 check. Grandmaster Delchev decided to play the more combative c takes d5, preparing to meet knight takes d5, supporting the c3 pawn with bishop a3, preventing black from castling for the time being. Bishop f8 isn't as bad of a response as it may appear, and in the game black decided to play bishop d7, preparing bishop c6, supporting the knight while x-raying the enemy bishop on g2, leading to a double-edged middle game struggle. In this symmetrical structure, white's most popular response is to play knight f3. Since black has adopted the same setup as white, this means black may explore ideas typically available when playing the white side of the English. e5, often preparing d6, and bishop e6 is a setup associated with world champion Mikhail Botvinnik. This is an English setup used by both white and black. Another important option to explore is e6, as played by world champion Bobby Fischer. What happens if black is content with maintaining symmetry with knight f6? This is a reasonable way to maintain flexibility and see how white may continue. There's nothing wrong with maintaining symmetry by castling, but if white would prefer to break the symmetry, then we can explore the central strike d4. If black tries to take the symmetrical approach to the extreme with d5, this is actually not as bad as it looks, but not only is castling a reasonable option, white can break the symmetry immediately with d takes c5, opening up the d-file for the queen with an excellent position for white. As white fights for more central control, the d4 pawn adds pressure against c5, while also contemplating the space-gaining d5. In response to d4, black typically exchanges pawns with c takes d4, knight takes d4, resolving the central tension but revealing the light-squared bishop's pressure against the knight on c6. This makes playing d6 more difficult, as this would remove an important defender of the c6 knight. It's possible to play knight takes d4 immediately, or in a battle between world champions, Grandmaster Vishwanathan Anand decided to castle. His opponent, Grandmaster Vladimir Kramnik, followed suit by castling as well. The provocative knight g4, discovering the dark-squared bishop's pressure against the knight on d4, is certainly a playable option the interested viewer may explore. But since the pressure against the knight on c6 makes the natural d6 difficult to play, Grandmaster Anand played the straightforward knight takes d4. Queen takes d4. This is a sensitive square for white's queen, as it aligns with the enemy dark-squared bishop. There isn't a useful discovery with the knight just yet, but this is an important theme to keep in mind. After exchanging knights, black typically plays d6, supporting the center while opening up a diagonal for the light-squared bishop. The dynamic potential of the dark-squared bishop should not be underestimated, because if white decides to play b3, supporting the c4 pawn and possibly preparing to fight for dark-squared control on the long diagonal, black can take advantage of the weakened dark squares with the central shot d5, attacking the c4 pawn while supporting the deadly threat knight e4, unleashing the dark-squared bishop's pressure against the queen and knight on the long diagonal. If white responds with c takes d5, this is well met by knight takes d5, discovering the bishop's attack against the queen, preparing to meet queen takes d5, with bishop takes c3, attacking white's rook on a1 as black's position is coming to life. White can still hold the balance with bishop h6, although this does allow an exchange of queens, followed by rook d8, when black enjoys an active position. Grandmaster Kramnik resolved the unpleasant alignment between white's queen and the enemy dark-squared bishop by playing queen d3, vacating the long dark-squared diagonal while still supporting the center, attacking the queen with bishop f5, provoking e4, restricting the light-squared bishop, before playing bishop e6 is an interesting option. And it's also possible to play like Grandmaster Anand with bishop e6, adding pressure against the c4 pawn and offering a sacrifice on b7. If white decides to accept this pawn sacrifice with bishop takes b7, black is prepared to respond with rook b8, taking advantage of the newly opened b-file, followed by queen a5, connecting the rooks on the back rank, building active counterplay against white's queenside. Instead of weakening the long dark-squared diagonal with b3, Grandmaster Kramnik decided to develop the dark-squared bishop to the modest d2 square, connecting the rooks on the back rank while supporting the knight on c3. The bishop may even find a moment to use the c3 square at some point, fighting for control over the long diagonal. Grandmaster Anand continued with queen d7, creating a queen-bishop battery pointing toward white's kingside while also supporting the b7 pawn. Kramnik continued with rook f to d1, centralizing the rook, aligning with the enemy queen on the d-file. Centralizing this rook also creates the additional option of meeting a potential bishop h3, intending to exchange bishops, with bishop h1. In this case, bishop h1 is a reasonable option, maintaining pressure against black's queenside. The bishop on h1 can look a bit awkward, but since black does not have a direct kingside attack, the placement of the bishop should not be a serious issue. White has a fairly straightforward way to complete development with rook a to c1, supporting the c-file while vacating the long diagonal, preparing to solidify the c3 pawn with b3. The c4 pawn fought for control over the d5 square from the very first move of the game, and it still remains an important positional factor, preventing black's d-pawn from favorably advancing. Rook a to b8, supporting the b7 pawn while vacating the long light-squared diagonal, as well as deciding to place either rook on c8 are interesting options to explore. Grandmaster Anand decided to generate counterplay with knight g4, preparing knight e5, attacking the queen as well as the c4 pawn. So Kramnik anticipated this idea by playing b3, reinforcing the c4 pawn but removing a defender of the knight on c3. This is why Kramnik's bishop on d2 is useful, helping support this knight. White is ready to address the unpleasant tension down the long diagonal with rook a to c1, so Anand attacked Kramnik's queen with knight e5. White centralized the queen on e4, attacking the b7 pawn. Black defended the pawn with rook a to b8, when white continued as planned with rook a to c1. White enjoys a space advantage thanks to the c4 pawn and overall light square control. The queen may find a more secure post on h4, adding pressure against black's kingside. This type of positional squeeze is a common goal for English players, and although it may be difficult for black to find concrete counterplay, the position itself remains relatively resilient with resources such as b6, relieving the tension between the b-pawn and white's light-squared bishop, as well as rook f to c8, clamping down on the c5 square. The English is a popular alternative to immediately occupying the center and may often transpose into d4 and in some cases e4 openings. This flexible opening also has its own independent lines to explore, initially fighting for central control from the flanks, delaying an immediate central confrontation. The English opening often produces subtle, positional struggles, but if both sides are willing, the game can become quite sharp. Thanks for exploring the strategically rich opening, and best of luck the next time c4 makes an appearance in your game, right here on chess.com.